A magnitude 5.4 earthquake hit early Monday morning, just after 3 a.m. local time, about 24 miles north of the city of Suez, Egypt. That puts the epicenter close to the northern end of the Suez Canal, one of the most important shipping corridors on the planet. So let's get straight into what actually happened, what's actually shaking under that region, and what disruptions really means here, because the honest answer is more nuanced than a headline can carry. Here's what we know for certain. Germany's GFZ Research Center measured the quake at magnitude 5.4 at a depth of about 10 kilometers, roughly 6 miles down. Egypt's own National Research Institute of Astronomy and Geophysics measured it slightly higher, at 5.6. That's a normal discrepancy. Different seismic networks process the same event with different models and get slightly different numbers, especially in the first hours. Nothing suspicious there. It happens with almost every moderate earthquake reported internationally. The shaking was felt across a wide area. People in Cairo felt it strongly enough to wake up. It reached as far as El Arish, near Egypt's border with Gaza, and tremors were reported in southern Israel, including the Negev and the Dead Sea area. T has a wide felt radius for a magnitude 5.4, which tells you it was shallow enough and the regional rock was efficient enough at carrying the shaking outward, consistent with the roughly 10-kilometer depth reported. And here's the number that actually matters most this morning: 0. Egypt's National Research Institute of Astronomy and Geophysics said it received no reports of casualties or damage to property. Israel's Homefront Command said there were no warnings of additional aftershocks affecting Israel. The Egyptian Ed Crescent activated its emergency response plan across the governorates, where the quake was felt, which is standard procedure. It doesn't mean damage was found. It means the protocol for a felt earthquake of this size was triggered, so responders were ready if reports came in. So before we go further, this was not a disaster. It was a strong, widely felt earthquake with no reported injuries and no reported structural damage. Now, that's the state of things as of this recording. And I want to be upfront about that instead of manufacturing tension where there isn't currently any. Now let's talk about where this happened, because the location is genuinely significant, independent of any drama. This earthquake sits in one of the more geologically complex junctions on Earth. You have the African plate to the west, the Arabian plate to the east, and the Sinai Peninsula sitting on a smaller block, often described as caught between them. This is the northern end of the Red Sea Rift system, the same rift that runs down through the Red Sea and connects further south to the East African Rift, one of the largest active rifting zones on the planet, where the African continent is slowly splitting apart. Layered onto that rifting is the Dead Sea Transform, a major strike-slip fault system that runs from the Red Sea up through the Gulf of Aqaba, the Dead Sea, and into Lebanon and Syria. Where the Gulf of Suez sits, you get a mix of both extensional stress, the ground pulling, apart, and transform motion, where blocks of crust slide past each other. That combination is exactly why this specific stretch of Egypt has a long history of moderate earthquakes, even though most people don't associate Egypt with major seismic activity the way they do California or Japan. It's worth being precise about magnitude here, because a 5.4 to 5.6 earthquake is a real felt event, but it is not in the range that typically produces widespread structural collapse on its own. That threshold generally starts becoming a serious concern for reinforced structures somewhere in the low to mid-6 range. And even then, depth, soil conditions, and building codes determine the outcome as much as the raw number does. A shallow, moderate earthquake like this one can crack plaster, rattle nerves, and knock things off shelves over a wide area, which is consistent with exactly what was reported. Strong shaking felt across multiple countries, and no damage. Now, why does an earthquake here matter more than an equivalent one somewhere remote? Because of what sits on top of this tectonic boundary, the Suez Canal. The canal is one of the most consequential choke points in global trade. Depending on the year and methodology, estimates for how much of global seaborne trade or global container traffic transits, the canal generally lands somewhere in the range of 10 to 15%. And it is the primary route connecting the Mediterranean to the Red Sea and Indian Ocean without sailing around the entire African continent. Any disruption to that route, whether from blockage, damage, or a shutdown, has outsized consequences for global shipping costs, oil and gas transport, and delivery timelines for goods moving between Europe and Asia. That's exactly why an earthquake near Suez draws attention that an equivalent quake somewhere less strategically located wouldn't. This isn't the first time this stretch of Egypt has shaken, and it's worth knowing the history so you have a sense of scale. The Gulf of Suez region has a documented record of moderate seismicity going back decades, tied to the same rifting and transform motion described above. Most of these events sit in the magnitude 3 to 5 range and pass without significant damage, because that's the typical energy release for this kind of extensional and strike-slip setting rather than a subduction zone capable of producing magnitude 8 or 9 events. Egypt as a whole isn't seismically silent, The country experienced a magnitude 5.8 earthquake centered near Dashur, south of Cairo, back in 1992, which did cause fatalities and damage specifically because it struck close to dense, older construct, Tayan in the greater Cairo area. That event is still the benchmark Egyptian seismologists and emergency planners reference when assessing risk to the capital. Monday's earthquake, by contrast, was centered in a much less densely built area north of Suez City and offshore in the Gulf itself, which is very likely part of why the outcome was so different. A broadly similar tectonic setting and a comparable order of magnitude, but a dramatically different level of exposure. That distinction, magnitude versus exposure, is one of the most consistently misunderstood parts of earthquake reporting. A magnitude 5.4 under an unpopulated stretch of desert or shallow Gulf water can produce a huge felt radius with zero damage, while a similarly sized quake under a dense, older urban core can be genuinely destructive. The number alone never tells you the outcome. Location, depth, soil type, and what's actually built on. Top of the shaking determine that far more than magnitude does. Monday's quake, occurring roughly 24 miles from Suez City rather than directly beneath it, and at a depth deep enough to spread the energy over a wide area rather than concentrate it, is a big part of why, felt strongly across 3 countries and zero damage reported, can both be true statements about the same event. But, and this is the important distinction, an earthquake felt near a choke point is not the same thing as an earthquake that damages that choke point. As of this recording, there's no reported damage to canal infrastructure, no reported disruption to shipping traffic, and no operational announcement from the Canal Authority indicating any change in operations. The canal's basic infrastructure, the waterway itself, the locks and passing bays, the traffic control systems, was not reported affected. So if you're asking, are ships being delayed right now because of this earthquake? The honest answer, based on what's publicly confirmed, is no, not from this event, not yet. That's worth sitting with because there's a difference between this happened near something important and this affected that important thing. A lot of coverage blurs that line, especially for a canal that's already been a major news story in recent years for entirely separate reasons. The 2021 grounding incident, an ongoing geopolitical tension in the Red Sea affecting shipping routes and insurance costs. It's tempting to fold every new event into that same narrative of the canal is under threat, but this earthquake on its own hasn't produced that outcome. It's worth separating the two very different kinds of disruption people mean when they ask a question like this. There's physical disruption, a blockage, structural damage to locks or banks, a grounded vessel, anything that mechanically stops ships from transiting. That's what happened in 2021 when a container ship ran aground and wedged itself across Suez Canal, halting traffic for roughly a week and holding up an estimated tens of billions of dollars in trade per day. It stayed blocked. And there's a separate category of disruption that's been building for the last couple of years. Reduced voluntary traffic due to security concerns in the wider Red Sea, as shipping companies have rerouted some vessels around the CA. P of Good Hope in response to attacks on commercial ships further south, near the Bab el-Mandeb Strait. That second kind of disruption has already been reducing Suez Canal transit revenue and traffic volume, and it has nothing to do with earthquakes. It's a function of regional conflict and insurance risk. Monday's earthquake sits in neither category so far. It's not a physical blockage, and it's not a security-driven rerouting decision. It's a geological event that happened near, but has not been shown to have damaged a piece of critical infrastructure. Conflating it with either of those other disruption stories, the 2021 grounding or the ongoing Red Sea security situation, would be inaccurate, even though all three understandably get filed under the same general anxiety about the canal's reliability. So what should you actually watch for if you want to track whether this becomes something more than a felt but harmless earthquake? Watch for aftershock activity. Moderate earthquakes in rift and transform zones like this one typically produce a sequence of smaller aftershocks in the days following the main shock. If those aftershocks stay small and taper off in the normal way, that's a standard sequence winding down. If a notably larger aftershock or a second main shock-sized event follows, that would be new information and worth taking seriously. Watch for any structural inspection reports. Canal authorities and municipal engineers in Suez, Ismailia, and surrounding governorates will likely conduct standard post-earthquake structural checks on infrastructure near the epicenter, even without confirmed damage, simply as a precaution. If any of those inspections turn up damage to canal-adjacent infrastructure, ports, or the cities along the canal, that's the point where disruption would move from speculative to real. Watch official statements from the Suez Canal Authority directly, rather than secondhand commentary. If shipping traffic changes, delays occur, or the Canal Authority issues any operational notice, that will be publicly announced, because international shippers and insurers depend on that information immediately. As of this recording, no such notice has been issued. Let's also put this earthquake in the context of regional seismic activity more broadly, because it didn't happen in isolation from a pattern worth understanding. The wider eastern Mediterranean and Middle East region has had a genuinely active stretch. In January and February of 2025, the area around Santorini in Greece experienced an intense, sustained earthquake swarm, tens of thousands of recorded tremors over several weeks, including a number in the mid-magnitude 5 range. Greek and international seismologists, Hussein, UDI that swarm concluded it was linked to a deep magmatic dike intrusion, essentially a body of magma forcing its way upward through the crust well beneath the seafloor, generating extended seismic unrest without producing a volcanic eruption. That event is well documented, and is a legitimate example of how this broader region, sitting at the junction of the African, Arabian, and Eurasian plates, regularly produces significant tectonic and volcanic unrest. That's useful context, because it establishes something real. This is, overall, a seismically active part of the world, sitting on multiple interacting plate boundaries, rift systems, and transform faults. That's a geological fact, not a prediction. What it does not mean is that any one earthquake into Eurostep. He region tells you when or where the next one will strike, or how large it will be. Modern seismology cannot forecast the specific timing, location, and magnitude of a future earthquake with meaningful precision. Anyone offering you a specific percentage chance of a specific magnitude earthquake at a specific location in the coming months is going well beyond the science can currently support, regardless of how confidently it's presented. That's true of professional seismologists as much as it is of anyone else. The honest scientific position is always some version of this region has elevated background risk because of its tectonics, not here is the exact probability of a magnitude 7 next year. It's worth explaining briefly why that limitation exists, because it isn't a gap in effort. It's a gap in the underlying physics being observable. Earthquakes are the release of stress that is built up gradually, over years or centuries, along a fault or across a rift system, as tectonic plate, as grind, stretch, or slide past one another. Seismologists can measure where that stress is accumulating using GPS ground deformation data, historical earthquake catalogs, and models of fault geometry, and from that, they can produce long-term hazard maps. Statements like, this fault has roughly a certain percent chance of producing a damaging earthquake over the next 50 years. That's genuine. Lie useful for building codes and insurance and infrastructure planning. And what nobody can currently do is identify the specific moment a fault will slip, because the final trigger, the last small increment of stress or the exact point of frictional failure, happens at a scale and unpredictability that current instruments can't resolve in advance. That's why credible seismic agencies issue aftershock probability forecasts, which are statistically grounded in how earthquake sequences typically behave. But they do not issue main shock predictions with specific dates, locations, and magnitudes for events that haven't started yet. Aftershock forecasting, to be specific about what that actually looks like, after a main shock like Monday's, the standard statistical pattern is a declining sequence of smaller aftershocks about the following days and weeks, following well-established patterns in how earthquake sequences decay over time. Occasionally, an aftershock sequence includes an event nearly as large as the main shock, or even larger, which then gets reclassified as the actual main shock in hindsight. That's a real, non-trivial possibility worth being aware of generally. It's part of why agencies avoid calling a sequence over too quickly. But assigning a specific numeric probability to a specific future magnitude at this location isn't something public seismic agencies have done for this event, and it isn't something I'm going to fabricate for you either. It's also worth directly addressing something that's been circulating alongside this earthquake. The idea that celestial events, planetary alignments, solar storms, geomagnetic activity, eclipses, are connected to, or can help forecast, earthquake activity. There is no established physical mechanism, and no body of peer-reviewed seismological research supporting a causal link between planetary positions or space weather and terrestrial earthquake triggering at the scale being discussed in some corners of the internet right now. Tidal forces from the sun and moon do exert a very small, well-studied stress on the Earth's CR. UST. This is real and measurable, but the effect is tiny compared to the tectonic stresses that actually generate earthquakes, and it does not translate into the kind of specific, large-scale predictions you'll see attached to this story. If a claim about this earthquake ties it to a solar storm, a planetary conjunction, or an UPC, ohming eclipse as a forecasting tool, that claim isn't coming from seismology. It's worth being skeptical of it, especially when it's delivered with specific numbers attached. Because specificity dressed up as science is exactly what makes this kind of claim persuasive, and exactly what makes it wrong. There's a separate, legitimate comparison worth drawing, though, and it's the one I mentioned earlier. The the Santorini earthquake swarm from January and February of 2025. That event is a genuinely useful reference point for understanding how this broader tectonic neighborhood behaves, because it shows two very different mechanisms that can both produce sustained seismic activity in this part of the world. Santorini's swarm was ultimately tied to a magma intrusion, molten rock physically forcing its way through the crust, generating tens of thousands of small to moderate earthquakes over several weeks without an eruption occurring. Monday's Suez earthquake is a different mechanism entirely. Ordinary tectonic strain release along a rift and transform boundary, the same kind of process that produces the majority of earthquakes worldwide, with no volcanic component involved at all. Both are real, both are explainable with established geophysics, and neither required an eruption, a war, or a celestial alignment to make sense. The lesson from putting them side by side isn't that they're connected, it's that this region sits on enough active geological boundaries that multiple, unrelated seismic and volcanic processes are simply more likely to produce activity here than in a geologically quiet part of the world. That's a statement about baseline probability, not a specific forecast. It's also worth touching on regional preparedness, since that's the practical piece underneath all of this. Egypt has updated its building codes over the decades specifically in response to earthquakes like the 1992 Dasher event, particularly for critical infrastructure and newer construction in seismically monitored ZO, NES. Older buildings and dense urban centers remain the primary vulnerability in any Egyptian earthquake scenario, which is exactly why proximity to population centers, rather than magnitude alone, tends to determine outcomes here. The Suez Canal Authority itself operates critical infrastructure. Locks, banks, dredged, channels, that is engineered to different standards than residential buildings, and there is no public indication that this earthquake's shaking approached levels that would threaten that kind of engineered infrastructure, particularly given the distance from the epicenter to the canal's most sensitive structures. Back to what we actually know. This was a magnitude 5.4 to 5.6 earthquake, shallow, centered roughly 24 miles north of Suez, in a well-understood tectonic setting where the Red Sea Rift, the Gulf of Suez, and the Dead Sea transform all interact. It was felt across a wide area from Kars, to the Sinai to southern Israel, which is expected given the depth and regional geology, not a sign that something unusual occurred. No injuries have been reported, no property damage has been reported, no disruption to Suez Canal operations has been reported or announced by canal authorities. The reason this earthquake is getting attention isn't because of what it's done, it's because of where it happened. The Suez Canal's economic and strategic importance means any seismic activity nearby will draw more coverage than an equivalent earthquake somewhere less consequential would. That's a reasonable thing to pay attention to. It is not, on its own, evidence that disruption is coming. If you want an honest, ongoing way to track this instead of relying on speculation, here's what to actually check, and how often it's worth checking it. The U.S. Geological Survey and Egypt's National Research Institute of Astronomy and Geophysics both publish real-time earthquake data, including aftershock sequences, for free, updated continuously as new events are detected and located. Germany's GFZ-DO has the same, independently, which is useful precisely because you can compare two networks against each other rather than relying on a single source. The Suez Canal Authority publishes operational notices directly whenever there's any change to canal operations, transit schedules, restrictions, or incidents, and internation. All shipping and insurance markets react to those notices within hours, which means if anything meaningful changes for canal traffic, it will show up in freely available shipping industry reporting almost immediately, not days later. Those are the sources that would actually tell you if the situation changes, not commentary tying the earthquake to celestial events, and not confident numeric predictions about future magnitudes that no current seismological method can actually produce. If a bigger aftershock happens, the agencies above will report it in real time. If canal operations are affected, the Canal Authority will say so directly, because global shipping depends on that information being accurate and immediate. Neither of those things has happened as of this recording. One last point, because it applies well beyond this single earthquake. Stories that combine a real, verifiable event with an unrelated dramatic framing, an eclipse, a planetary alignment, a specific numeric prediction, tend to spread faster than the plain version of the story, precisely because the added drama makes it more shareable. That's exactly backwards from how you'd want to evaluate risk to something as consequential as global shipping infrastructure. The plain version here is genuinely worth knowing. A real earthquake happened, in a real active tectonic zone, near a real, strategically vital CA. No, and so far, verifiably, nothing about that canal's operation has changed. That's not a less interesting story than the dramatized version. It's a more accurate one, and for something with this much economic weight riding on it, accuracy is the part that actually matters. As of right now, a felt moderate earthquake near a critical global choke point, no casualties, no damage, no disruption to shipping. If that changes, it'll be because of what the instruments in the Canal Authority report next, not because of anything in the sky.